Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history from Millfield, Massachusetts. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1893. The town of Millfield, Massachusetts was known for its textile mills and the hard-working families that kept them running. Like many New England towns of that era, Millfield had its fair share of Victorian homes with their characteristic steep roofs and ornate trim. Among these stood a modest two-story house on Evergreen Street, set apart from its neighbors, not by its architecture, but by the profession of its owner, Thomas Blackwood, the town undertaker. Millfield's municipal records, preserved in the State Archive, show that Thomas had been the town's primary mortician since 1879, taking over the business from his uncle, Jeremiah Blackwood, following the older man's stroke. Thomas had apprenticed under his uncle for 7 years, learning the delicate arts of embalming and funeral preparation at a time when such practices were evolving rapidly in America. The transition of ownership was documented in the business registry on March 15, 1879, with Thomas listed as the sole proprietor at the age of 29. His reputation was that of a solemn, reserved man who performed his duties with dignity and precision. The townspeople respected him, though few sought his company outside of professional necessity. After all, death was considered an uncomfortable topic in polite society, and those who handled the dead were often viewed with a mixture of gratitude and unease. The Millfield Gazette archives contain occasional mentions of Thomas in the years before the incidents of 1893. He served on the town cemetery committee, attended the annual Founders' Day celebrations, and once donated a substantial sum to the library for books on medical science. A brief profile published in 1885 described him as a gentleman of quiet demeanor and refined tastes, whose dedication to his somber profession brings dignity to moments of family grief. The article noted his unmarried status, but made no suggestion that this was considered unusual for a man of his position. Thomas was, by all accounts, a model professional. His meticulous attention to detail and respectful handling of the deceased earned him grudging admiration from the community. The county medical examiner, Dr. Richard Palmer, noted in his correspondence to a colleague in Boston that Blackwood's preservation techniques were among the finest he had seen outside of major cities. His subjects maintain a remarkably natural appearance, Palmer wrote in a letter dated 1888, without the artificial rigidity or discoloration so common in the work of lesser practitioners. One almost expects them to stir, so lifelike is their repose. Local newspapers occasionally mentioned his services in glowing, if brief, notices, following prominent citizens' funerals. Following the death of Judge William Harrison in 1890, the Gazette reported that Mr. Blackwood's expert ministrations allowed the Harrison family the comfort of seeing their patriarch at peaceful rest, his dignity and likeness perfectly maintained in death. What few people knew, according to business records later discovered in the town archives, was that Thomas had spent considerable time studying advanced techniques in Europe during the winter of 1887. A passport application found among his personal papers and shipping manifests from the White Star Line confirm he traveled to Paris and Vienna, centers of medical innovation at the time. His travel journal, recovered during the investigation, reveals his purpose, to study under Dr. Anton Meixner in Vienna, whose pioneering work in chemical preservation was revolutionizing the field. Dr. Meixner's approach transcends mere preparation for viewing, Thomas wrote on January 12, 1888. He speaks of arrested time, a suspension of decay so complete that the subject might appear unchanged for decades, not merely days. His formula, which he guards jealously, incorporates compounds I have never encountered in American practice. He has specimens preserved 10 years ago that retain the suppleness and color of life. This is artistry, beyond mere trade. When he returned to Millfield in the spring of 1888, he began implementing subtle changes to his practice that elevated his work above that of ordinary small-town undertakers. Receipts from chemical suppliers in Boston show increased orders for arsenic compounds, specialized alcohols, and metallic salts not commonly used in standard embalming procedures of the time. The Blackwood Funeral Home itself was a study in Victorian sensibilities regarding death. The building, constructed in 1865, had originally been a large private residence before Jeremiah Blackwood converted it to its new purpose. The front parlor, where viewings were held, was decorated in deep burgundies and forest greens, with heavy velvet curtains that could be drawn to adjust the lighting according to the family's preferences. Ornate silver candelabras stood in the corners, and the chairs were upholstered in a somber brocade that muffled sound and movement. A small pump organ occupied one corner, available for musical accompaniment during services. The effect, as described by Millfield resident Catherine Dunham in her memoirs, published in 1930, was a dignified solemnity that somehow eased the burden of grief, if only by acknowledging its weight. Dunham, who attended multiple funerals there over the years, noted that Mr. Blackwood seemed to understand intuitively the proper atmosphere for mourning, neither overly sentimental nor coldly clinical, but a space where death's reality was draped in just enough gentility to make it bearable. Behind this public space lay Thomas's workroom, a space few townspeople ever saw. According to architectural plans filed with the town hall, when Thomas renovated the building in 1885, this room was significantly larger than might be expected, with specialized drainage in the floor, extensive shelving along the walls, and a separate entrance that allowed bodies to be delivered discreetly. The room faced north, providing consistent, indirect light, ideal for the delicate work of embalming and preparation. Thomas invested substantial sums in outfitting this workspace. Invoices found among his business records show purchases of specialized tools from surgical supply companies in New York and Philadelphia, scalpels of varying sizes, arterial tubes, trocar needles, and precision instruments for facial feature setting. In 1889, he commissioned a custom-built preparation table from a medical equipment manufacturer in Boston, specifying a marble surface with channels for drainage and a tilting mechanism for optimal positioning. Before February 1893, Thomas had lived alone in the residence portion of the building, 6 rooms that formed a separate wing, connected to the funeral home by a short hallway and a locked door. His personal quarters were known to few in Millfield. Even his rare social acquaintances were typically entertained in a small sitting room near the business entrance rather than invited into his private domain. The residential section included a parlor, dining room, kitchen, study, and 2 bedrooms, modest but comfortable accommodations for a man of his professional standing. According to Martha Holloway, one of the few townspeople who had visited this private space before 1893, the rooms were neat and well-appointed, though lacking a woman's touch. In her journal, she described shelves of medical and scientific books, a few landscape paintings of considerable quality, and furniture that, while not extravagant, suggested refined taste. Notably absent were family photographs or personal mementos, creating an impression of elegant impersonality. In February of 1893, a notice appeared in the Millfield Gazette announcing the marriage of Thomas Blackwood to a woman named Eleanor Pierce. The announcement was brief, containing only the essential information and lacking the usual flourish of social events. According to the marriage certificate preserved in the county archives, Eleanor was 32 years old at the time, unusually late for a first marriage in that era. The document listed her as previously residing in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, with no family members in attendance at the ceremony. The wedding itself was a quiet affair, conducted by Justice of the Peace Arthur Hammond, rather than in one of Millfield's churches. Hammond's records, discovered during a courthouse renovation in 1956, note only that the bride was of pale complexion and reserved manner, and that the ceremony was brief with no guests present. The document is signed by Thomas Eleanor with a notably shaky signature and two witnesses, Hammond's clerk and the town pharmacist Edward Green, who appears to have been called in from his nearby shop to serve as a second witness. Green later commented to his wife in a private letter that he found the proceedings oddly perfunctory and that the bride seemed delicate, almost fragile, speaking her responses in a voice barely above a whisper. He also noted that Thomas had arranged the ceremony with unusual haste, contacting Hammond only the day before and offering a substantial fee for his immediate services. What raised eyebrows among the townsfolk was not the marriage itself, but rather how little anyone knew about the bride. Eleanor seemed to have appeared in Millfield with no introduction, no connections, and no history that anyone could verify. The town clerk's records show no other Pierce family in the area, and inquiries to Harrisburg authorities in 1961 revealed no conclusive records of an Eleanor Pierce matching her description. A thorough search of Pennsylvania records conducted by Dr. Reynolds in the 1960s found several Eleanor Pierces who had lived in Harrisburg during the early 1890s, but none who disappeared or died during the relevant period. The most promising candidate was an Eleanor J. Pierce, who worked as a seamstress and boarded at a respectable women's residence on Market Street, but city directories show her still residing there in 1894, a year after Eleanor Pierce supposedly married Thomas Blackwood. In a town where most residents could trace their families back generations, Eleanor's sudden appearance and immediate marriage to the Undertaker became a source of quiet speculation. According to journal entries from Millfield resident Martha Holloway, dated March 1893, Eleanor was described as a woman of pale complexion and serious demeanor, who seems to complement Mr. Blackwood's somber nature perfectly. Martha further noted that Eleanor dresses exclusively in dark colors, as if perpetually in mourning, though her marriage is still fresh. In an entry dated March 18th, Holloway described a brief encounter with the new Mrs. Blackwood at Green's Pharmacy. I offered my congratulations on her recent marriage, and she acknowledged them with a slight nod but no smile. Her eyes struck me as unusual, very clear and steady, yet somehow vacant, as though looking through rather than at me. When I inquired after her adjustment to our town, Mr. Blackwood answered for her, explaining that his wife found extended conversation taxing. There is something in their manner together that suggests more of a physician with his patient than a husband with his bride. The few who claim to have glimpsed Mrs. Blackwood described her inconsistently. Some mentioned her as tall and statuesque, others as petite and delicate. Her hair was variously described as deep auburn, light brown, or black. The only consistent details were her pale skin and her preference for high-necked dresses in dark colors. This inconsistency would later be viewed as significant by investigators, though at the time it was attributed to the limited and fleeting nature of these sightings. Rebecca Collins, who sang in the church choir with Thomas, reported seeing Mrs. Blackwood only once, sitting in the Blackwood carriage outside the church after Sunday services in late February. She remained in the carriage while Mr. Blackwood spoke with Reverend Thompson, Collins later told Constable Porter. She sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, looking straight ahead. I approached to introduce myself, but Mr. Blackwood quickly intercepted me, explaining that his wife was fatigued and they needed to return home promptly. What struck me was how he positioned himself between me and the carriage, as if to prevent me from getting too close a look at her. The Blackwoods lived in the residence attached to the funeral parlor, a common arrangement for undertakers of the time. The building consisted of 3 sections: the funeral parlor, where services were held, the work area where bodies were prepared, and the private residence. A door connected the living quarters to the business, allowing Thomas easy access to his work at all hours. Thomas soon began making modifications to the residential portion of the building. Records from Millfield Hardware show purchases of additional locks, blackout curtain material, and specialized glass. Harrison's construction was engaged in March to install what was described as a cabinet room with environmental controls, an unusual feature for a residential space in 1893. The workers were restricted to certain hours and areas, with Thomas overseeing every aspect of the installation. According to the recollections of Abigail Foster, whose father delivered coal to the Blackwood home, the residence windows were always covered with heavy drapes, even during the day. "My father said it was the darkest house he'd ever entered," she told the Millfield Historical Society in a 1950 interview. "The lamps were always lit, even at midday, and there was a peculiar smell, not unpleasant but strange, like flowers and chemicals mixed together." Foster's father Jacob mentioned to several acquaintances that the coal consumption at the Blackwood home was unusually high, particularly for the warmer months. "He keeps that house as cold as January, even in June," Jacob reportedly said to fellow workers at the mill. Says his wife requires cool temperatures for her health. "Never known a living soul to need a house so cold you can see your breath in the parlor in springtime." What happened in the months following their marriage would become the subject of hushed conversations for decades to come. It began with observations so subtle that individually they would hardly be worth noting. Local delivery men reported that Mrs. Blackwood never seemed to leave the house. The grocer, Samuel Wilson, noted in his account ledger that Thomas always collected their orders himself, explaining that his wife was of delicate constitution and preferred the comfort of home. The town doctor, James Harrington, mentioned in correspondence to a colleague in Boston that he had never been called to treat Mrs. Blackwood, despite rumors of her fragile health. "I find it curious," Harrington wrote in April 1893, "that Blackwood speaks frequently of his wife's various sensitivities and ailments, yet has never requested my professional services. When I directly offered to call on Mrs. Blackwood, he politely but firmly declined, stating that her conditions were well understood and required specialized management rather than conventional treatment. His background in anatomy and chemistry apparently gives him confidence in treating her himself, though this seems to extend beyond the usual husband's care into something more proprietary." Joseph Miller, who delivered milk to the Blackwood residence 3 times a week, mentioned in a later statement to police that he had begun leaving 2 quarts on Mondays and Thursdays, but only 1 quart on Saturdays. When asked why, he explained that Thomas had specifically requested this arrangement, saying that Mrs. Blackwood takes less nourishment toward the end of the week due to her condition. Miller also noted that despite delivering to the home for months, he never once saw Eleanor, though occasionally he heard what he described as a woman's voice, very soft, almost like humming, from somewhere inside the house. Contrary to what might be expected, Thomas became more social after his marriage, not less. He attended community events more regularly and joined the Town Improvement Committee in April. This increased visibility, combined with his wife's complete absence from public life, only heightened curiosity about the Blackwood household. When directly questioned about his wife's reclusiveness, Thomas provided consistent but vague explanations about Eleanor's unique sensitivities to light, sound, and temperature. At a town meeting in May, when directly asked by Councilman Perkins about his wife's health, Thomas gave what several attendees later described as an uncomfortably detailed explanation about Eleanor's supposed condition. He spoke with the authority of a physician, using medical terminology that few of us understood, detailing how certain stimuli caused systemic reactions in his wife's delicate constitution. What struck me was his animation when discussing these ailments. He seemed almost proud of their complexity and his expertise in managing them. Eleanor's isolation might have been dismissed as the natural shyness of a newcomer, or perhaps a reflection of the social awkwardness that came with being married to the town undertaker. He described something he called acute environmental sensitivity, requiring carefully controlled surroundings, recalled William Drake, the town clerk. But other peculiarities began to emerge as spring turned to summer. Sarah Jenkins, who worked as a seamstress just across from the Blackwood Funeral Home, kept a daily diary that was discovered during renovations to her former shop in 1952. Her entries from June and July of 1893 mention seeing lights in the funeral parlor at unusual hours, long after midnight, when no services were scheduled. She wrote of hearing the piano in the parlor playing softly in the early morning hours, though no one was known to be using the space. June 14, 1893. Woke again to the sound of music from across the street. The same melody as before, slow and mournful. It was just past 2 o'clock. The light in the viewing room was lit, though I know there are no services scheduled until Thursday. Mr. Blackwood was seen taking delivery of Mrs. Harrison only this morning, and her viewing is not to begin until tomorrow afternoon. Such entries appeared with increasing frequency throughout the summer months. In one particularly detailed passage, dated July 3rd, Jenkins described watching from her window as Thomas carried what appeared to be a dress form or mannequin from the work area into the residential section of the building late at night. It was wrapped in a sheet, she wrote, but the shape was unmistakably that of a woman, rigid and still. He handled it with such care, almost tenderness. I should think nothing of it. He likely uses such forms for fitting burial clothes, but there was something in his manner that unsettled me deeply. On July 17th, Jenkins recorded what she considered an especially disturbing incident. Tonight, well after 11, I observed Mr. Blackwood in the yard behind the funeral home. He was burning what appeared to be papers or small items of clothing in a metal container. The flames illuminated his face occasionally, and I was struck by his expression, intent, almost fevered. He continued this activity for nearly an hour, occasionally consulting what looked like a notebook, tearing pages out methodically and adding them to the fire. When finished, he gathered the ashes carefully into a small box before returning inside. There is something in such methodical destruction that suggests more than routine disposal. The most curious detail came from the local pharmacist, Edward Green. His dispensary records, preserved in the Millfield Historical Society archives, show that Thomas Blackwood began purchasing unusual quantities of certain chemicals in the summer of 1893. These included formaldehyde and various preserving agents in amounts that exceeded what would be necessary for his normal business operations. When questioned by Green, Thomas explained that he was experimenting with new preservation techniques to better serve the community. The substances Thomas ordered became increasingly specialized as summer progressed. In June, his purchases were primarily standard embalming chemicals in somewhat excessive quantities. By August, he was special ordering compounds rarely used outside medical research facilities: mercuric chloride in high concentrations, arsenic compounds, specialized alcohols, and experimental fixatives recently developed in Germany. Green's personal journal, discovered among his effects after his death in 1910, reveals more concern than his professional records indicated. I find myself troubled by Blackwood's recent orders, he wrote in an entry dated July 18, 1893. Today he requested a solution of arsenic and mercury that has no common application in modern embalming. When I inquired as to its purpose, he became agitated, speaking rapidly about the advancement of the mortuary sciences and preservation that transcends the ordinary. There was an intensity in his eyes that I have never before witnessed in our typically reserved Undertaker. Perhaps most telling was an entry from August the 2nd, in which Green described a conversation with Thomas about his wife. He spoke of Eleanor's health, claiming the summer heat was particularly taxing for her. When I suggested a tonic that might provide relief, he declined, saying she was beyond the reach of conventional remedies. His choice of words struck me as odd, but his tone brooked no further discussion. More concerning still was his request for rose-scented oil, which he specified must be of the highest quality. When I asked if this was for a customer, he replied, "It is for my wife's comfort. She deserves only the finest fragrances." Yet something in his manner suggested he was not speaking of perfume for a living woman. The pharmacist's concerns grew to the point that he confided in Dr. Harrington in early August. The doctor's personal notes, discovered among his papers after his death, record this conversation. Green visited today, expressing unease about Blackwood's recent behavior. He described chemical purchases that seem excessive even for an active mortuary practice. Most troubling was his account of Blackwood's manner, an intensity bordering on obsession when discussing certain preservation techniques, contrasted with an almost dreamy detachment when speaking of his wife. Green reports never having seen Mrs. Blackwood in his shop, though most wives in town visit regularly. When I suggested calling on the Blackwoods socially to observe the situation, Green became uncomfortable, saying there was something about the household that discourages casual visits. I find myself increasingly curious about this marriage that no one seems to witness directly. By August, the atmosphere around the Blackwood home had changed. Neighbors reported an unusual stillness, even for a place associated with death. Thomas, who had always been punctual and methodical in his business affairs, began to show signs of distraction. Church records indicate he missed Sunday services for 3 consecutive weeks, something unprecedented in his 14 years as a member of the congregation. Reverend Thompson noted this absence in his journal on August 20th. Mr. Blackwood has not attended worship for the 3rd Sunday in succession. When I called at the funeral home to inquire after his and Mrs. Blackwood's welfare, he received me in the business parlor rather than his residence. He appeared disheveled, with several days' growth of beard, most unlike his usual fastidious presentation. When I expressed concern, he spoke of being engaged in important work that cannot be interrupted. He assured me that his wife was as well as can be expected, but required his constant attention. There was a feverish quality to his speech and movements that left me deeply concerned for his spiritual and mental state. When he did appear in public, Thomas's appearance had subtly altered. His clothing, always impeccable before, sometimes showed signs of neglect, a missing button, a collar not quite straight. His once precise movements became hurried and nervous. At a town meeting on August 10th, regarding the expansion of the cemetery, several attendees noted that Thomas's hands shook visibly when he rose to speak about the proper maintenance of family plots. James Wilson, the town clerk who recorded minutes of this meeting, wrote, "Mr. Blackwood's appearance and manner caused considerable comment among those present. His usual composure was entirely absent, replaced by a nervous energy that manifested in rapid speech and unsteady gestures. Most notable was his passionate argument against the proposed standardization of headstone heights, which he called an affront to individual expression in remembrance. This vehemence seemed disproportionate to the matter at hand, particularly coming from one usually so measured in his public statements. The town postmaster, Henry Mills, noted in his personal records that Thomas had begun receiving an unusual volume of mail from medical suppliers in Boston and New York. Mills, known for his curiosity about the town's affairs, observed that some packages were marked with red stamps, indicating special handling for delicate or scientific materials. One particular delivery in late August caught Mills's attention enough to warrant a detailed entry in his journal. "Today a crate arrived for Blackwood from the Medical College in Philadelphia," he wrote. "It was marked fragile, scientific instruments, and required 2 men to move. Blackwood appeared unusually agitated when collecting it, insisting on transporting it himself, despite its obvious weight. When the delivery man offered assistance, he refused almost angrily, saying the contents were of a delicate and private nature." Mills also noted a pattern in Thomas's mail that struck him as peculiar. "He receives regular correspondence from a Dr. Friedrich Müller in Vienna," he wrote in early September. "These letters arrive monthly, always in thick envelopes, suggesting numerous pages. Blackwood collects them personally, often waiting at the office on days when the European mail is due. His eagerness suggests these communications are of significant importance to him." September brought a change in Thomas's business practices. His advertisement in the Millfield Gazette, which had run unchanged for years, was updated to include mention of innovative preservation methods for those desiring extended viewings or transport to distant locations. The wording struck some as unusual, particularly the phrase, "lifelike appearance guaranteed through advanced European techniques." The town's longtime printer, Harold Jenkins, father of Sarah Jenkins, later recalled a conversation with Thomas about this advertisement. He was most particular about the wording, Jenkins told investigators in 1894. He rewrote it several times, each version emphasizing the lifelike quality of his preparations. When I suggested that families might find such explicit reference to the appearance of their departed uncomfortable, he became quite stern, insisting that the perfection of the illusion is what brings true comfort. There was something unsettling in his fixation on this aspect of his work. Thomas also began to decline certain funeral arrangements, becoming selective about which cases he would accept. Correspondence between Thomas and local physicians reveals that he expressed particular interest in young women who had died of non-disfiguring conditions, especially those with distinguished features or aesthetic presentations, as he phrased it in a letter to Dr. Palmer, dated September 8th. In contrast, he referred several cases involving elderly men or those with significant trauma to his competitor in Westbrook. This selectivity, unusual for a small-town undertaker dependent on a limited clientele, did not go unnoticed. Dr. Palmer mentioned it in a letter to a colleague, writing, "Our local mortician has developed curious preferences in his practice, selecting subjects as an artist might choose models with an eye to some aesthetic standard known only to himself." It was in late September when the first truly troubling incident occurred. According to police records dated September 28, 1893, Thomas Blackwood reported a break-in at his funeral parlor. Nothing of value was taken, but Thomas claimed that someone had disturbed his work area, moving tools and leaving a window open. The constable who investigated, William Porter, noted that Thomas seemed unusually agitated about the intrusion and particularly concerned about access to the private quarters of the home. The alleged break-in occurred during a night when Thomas had been called away to collect the body of a farmer who had died suddenly in the northern part of the county. According to his statement to Constable Porter, he had left at approximately 9 p.m. and returned shortly after midnight to find a side window of his work area ajar and several instruments moved from their usual positions. Porter's official report was brief and professional, but his personal diary, which came to light during a family estate sale in 1939, reveals more. Blackwood's concern seemed disproportionate to the apparent crime, he wrote. While he claimed nothing was stolen, he appeared almost frantic about the possibility that someone might have entered the connecting door to his residence. When I suggested interviewing Mrs. Blackwood to see if she had noticed anything unusual, he became visibly pale and insisted she was indisposed and must not be disturbed under any circumstances. There was something in his manner that suggested more than the usual concern for a wife's comfort. Porter also noted that he found no clear evidence of forced entry, suggesting the possibility that Thomas had either left the window unlocked or fabricated the incident entirely. When I pointed this out, suggesting it might have been the wind through the open window, Blackwood insisted someone had definitely entered, claiming he could sense the disturbance in the atmosphere of the room. Most telling was his repeated checking of a locked cabinet, the contents of which he refused to disclose, saying only that it contained specialized materials of a sensitive nature. What makes this incident stand out is that it was the first time any one official had tried to enter the Blackwood residence since Eleanor's arrival. "The window latch shows no sign of tampering," he wrote, "and the disturbance in the workroom is minor. A few instruments out of place, papers somewhat disarranged." Constable Porter's report mentions that Thomas insisted on keeping the residential portion of the building off limits during the investigation, claiming his wife was indisposed and must not be disturbed. Porter, respecting the privacy of a town businessman, did not press the issue. In the wake of the break-in, Thomas installed additional locks on the funeral home's doors and windows. According to receipts from the Millfield hardware store, he purchased not only new locks, but also heavy curtain material, described as black velvet, light-blocking quality, presumably for the windows of his work area. The store owner, Benjamin Harris, later recalled that Thomas had mentioned wanting to ensure complete privacy for his specialized work. Harris's statement to investigators in 1894 included an observation that seemed minor at the time, but later took on greater significance. Blackwood purchased an unusual lock for the interior door connecting his workspace to his residence. Unlike standard locks that require a key on one side only, this mechanism required keys on both sides, meaning the door could be locked or unlocked from either direction. When I commented on this unusual feature, suggesting it might be inconvenient, he said it was essential for security on both sides. The implication that something in his residence needed to be secured from his workspace struck me as odd, though I didn't dwell on it at the time. October brought unusually cold weather to Millfield that year, according to meteorological records preserved at the State University. The early frost seemed to coincide with a change in Thomas Blackwood's public demeanor. Those who encountered him described a man increasingly haggard and withdrawn. The town barber, Frank Miller, mentioned to several customers that Thomas had developed a noticeable tremor in his hands, hardly an ideal trait for someone in his profession. Miller's observations were recorded in a statement to Constable Porter following later events. "I had been cutting Mr. Blackwood's hair monthly for nearly 15 years, and he had always been a man of few words but impeccable composure. When he came to me in early October, I barely recognized him. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and bloodshot. His hands shook so badly that I feared for his ability to perform his delicate work. When I inquired after his health, he muttered something about the strain of perfection and the demands of preservation. He seemed to be speaking more to himself than to me." Miller also noted that Thomas had cut himself severely while being shaved, yet showed almost no reaction to the injury. "Most men would flinch, or at least acknowledge such a cut," he stated, but Blackwood seemed barely to notice the blood on his collar. When I apologized and offered to treat the wound, he waved away my concern with an odd comment about having become accustomed to blood in pursuit of perfection. It was not the statement of a normal man discussing a shaving nick. Another notable change was Thomas's sudden interest in acquiring specialized glassware. Invoices found in his papers show orders placed with scientific supply companies in Boston for bell jars, specimen containers, and custom glass cases with brass fittings. The accompanying letters requested absolute clarity and seamless construction, suitable for the display of delicate preserved specimens. A reply from Wentworth Scientific Supply, dated October 9th, inquired whether the unusually large glass case Thomas had commissioned was intended for an institutional display, noting that such extensive vitrines are typically used by medical colleges or museums rather than private practitioners. Thomas's response, preserved in his letter book, specified that the case was for a special private collection requiring optimal viewing conditions while maintaining a completely sealed environment. Most telling were the observations of Reverend Howard Thompson. In his private journal, discovered after his death in 1912, the Reverend wrote of a conversation with Thomas following a funeral service in mid-October. Thomas had reportedly asked theological questions about the nature of death and sin, specifically whether actions taken out of devotion, however misguided, might be forgiven in the eyes of God. The Reverend, concerned by the Undertaker's troubled state, offered counsel, but Thomas declined to elaborate on what was troubling him. The Reverend's journal entry for October 16th provides a more detailed account of this conversation. After the Franklin service, Thomas lingered until the family had departed. I found him standing before the crucifix, his expression one of profound distress. When I approached, he asked me whether God might forgive a man who defied death itself. not out of pride, but love. I reminded him that only Christ has conquered death, and men who attempt to usurp God's dominion over life's end often find themselves entangled in grave sin. At this he became agitated, insisting that his hypothetical man sought not to challenge God, but to preserve what God had created, to maintain its beauty against corruption. His intensity disturbed me deeply, and I suggested he come to confession. He declined, saying some actions, once begun, cannot be undone without greater sin. Thompson made several attempts to visit the Blackwood home in late October, concerned for Thomas's spiritual welfare. Each time he was received in the funeral parlor rather than the residence, and each time Thomas politely but firmly declined offers of spiritual counsel or community support. He has built walls around himself and whatever troubles him, the Reverend wrote on October 28th. I fear those walls grow higher with each passing day, shutting out not just human comfort, but divine grace as well. By November, rumors began to circulate more openly about the strange goings-on at the Blackwood home. Several residents reported hearing muffled sounds coming from the building late at night. Not quite voices, but mechanical noises, and what some described as the scraping of metal against stone. Thomas's business began to suffer, as some families requested that their deceased loved ones be sent to a funeral home in the neighboring town of Westbrook. Night watchman Peter Collins, whose route took him past the Blackwood establishment at 2 a.m., reported to friends that he often saw lights moving through the building at that hour, sometimes in the work area, sometimes in the residence. "It ain't natural, the hours that man keeps," Collins was quoted as saying in a statement collected later. "Sometimes I hear what sounds like a woman humming or singing, real soft-like. But when I mentioned this to Blackwood one morning, he got real sharp with me, saying I must have heard the wind in the chimney. But wind don't sound like a woman singing the same tune night after night." The decline in Thomas's professional standing became evident in the funeral notices published in the Millfield Gazette. Where once his services had been sought by the town's most prominent families, by early November his name appeared less frequently. When questioned about this by the newspaper's editor, Thomas reportedly became defensive, claiming his reduced clientele allowed him to focus on more specialized and significant work. James Morton, editor of the Gazette, later recalled that Thomas had seemed almost relieved by the decrease in business. When I asked directly about rumors regarding unusual activities at his establishment, he became quite animated, launching into a technical discourse about advances in preservation science that he claimed would revolutionize our understanding of death's boundaries. The fervor with which he spoke was unsettling, the passion of a man consumed by an idea beyond reason. Elizabeth Cooper, whose dress shop stood 2 doors down from the funeral parlor, reported to friends that she had twice seen Thomas carrying large bundles of fabric from his carriage into the back entrance of his establishment late at night. He spoke of being engaged in work of true importance, compared to which routine funerals were mere distractions, Morton stated. "Not the usual black crepe or white linen one expects," she said, according to accounts later given to investigators, "but rich materials, velvet and satin in deep blues and burgundies, the sort one would use for an evening gown, not burial clothes." When Cooper encountered Thomas at the general store several days later and inquired conversationally about his purchases, his response struck her as odd. He said he was preparing for a special presentation and that only the finest materials were suitable for her station, Cooper recalled. When I asked if he was referring to a prominent deceased person, he smiled in a way that made me uncomfortable and said, "She is beyond ordinary distinctions now." I assumed he meant deceased, but there was something in his manner that suggested another meaning entirely. The town's general discomfort with the Blackwood establishment intensified following an incident at the general store on November 10th. According to multiple witnesses, Thomas entered the store to collect his weekly order, but became highly agitated when informed that a shipment of candles he had requested had not arrived. He nearly shouted at poor Mrs. Davis, recalled customer Harriet Simmons in a later statement. Said something about the atmosphere being ruined and the effect diminished without the proper lighting. When Mrs. Davis suggested ordinary candles might suffice, he muttered something about nothing ordinary being acceptable for her. We all assumed he meant a deceased person from a prominent family, but his reaction seemed excessive even so. Following this public display of temper, uncharacteristic for the normally reserved Undertaker, several residents reported avoiding the Blackwood establishment entirely. Parents instructed their children not to walk past the building on their way to school, and delivery men requested different routes. This growing isolation seemed only to accelerate Thomas's descent into whatever obsession had captured him. The turning point came on the night of November 15, 1893. A severe storm hit Millfield, causing minor flooding along the river and damaging several buildings. Among them was the Blackwood Funeral Home, where a portion of the roof collapsed over the work area. This incident, documented in both town records and the November 16th edition of the Millfield Gazette, would inadvertently expose what had been hidden behind the Undertaker's doors. The storm itself was unusually violent for November, with high winds and driving rain that lasted from early evening until past midnight. Weather records from the State University archives describe it as a late-season tempest of remarkable ferocity, with wind speeds estimated at over 50 miles per hour. Several buildings suffered damage, including the church steeple and the roof of the schoolhouse, but it was the partial collapse of the Blackwood Funeral Home that would prove most consequential for the town. The Gazette reported that a large oak tree adjacent to the funeral home had been uprooted by the wind, crashing through the roof of the work area shortly after 11 p.m. The damage was significant, with the tree penetrating the ceiling and allowing rain to pour into the structure. A neighbor, hearing the crash, alerted the volunteer fire brigade despite the continuing storm. According to the official report filed by Fire Chief George Anderson, who responded to the incident, the damage required immediate attention due to the nature of the business and the materials stored within. Despite Thomas's protests, emergency workers needed to enter the damaged area to prevent chemical spills and further structural collapse. Anderson's report, filed the following day, describes the scene upon their arrival. We found Mr. Blackwood attempting to cover the damaged section with tarpaulins, despite the ongoing rain and dangerous conditions. He appeared distraught, beyond what the situation warranted, repeatedly insisting that he could manage the damage himself and that no one else need enter the premises. When informed that safety regulations required our inspection due to the chemicals known to be stored on site, he became nearly hysterical, placing himself physically between our men and the entrance to his work area. The report continues, due to the potential hazards and Mr. Blackwood's increasingly erratic behavior, I was forced to insist on immediate access. Only when Constable Porter arrived and formally ordered him to comply did Blackwood reluctantly step aside, though he continued to follow us closely as we inspected the damage, moving items out of our way before we could properly examine them. What they found in the work area was, by all accounts, disturbing even for a mortician's laboratory. Chief Anderson's report, sealed until 1950 due to its sensitive nature, describes an unusual arrangement of the space. The typical preparation tables had been pushed aside to make room for what appeared to be a makeshift laboratory. Glass containers lined the walls, filled with various preserving fluids and specimens that went beyond the normal requirements of an undertaker. Anderson's description is clinical but revealing. The workspace had been substantially modified from its original purpose. The embalming table remained, but was surrounded by scientific apparatus more suited to a medical research facility than a funeral home. Multiple glass containers of various sizes contained what appeared to be preserved tissue samples in different stages of treatment. A large journal lay open on a desk, filled with detailed notes and anatomical drawings. Most concerning was a collection of what appeared to be experimental preservation techniques applied to human facial features, eyes, lips, and skin samples, mounted on wooden forms. Later inspection of the journal, which was confiscated as evidence, revealed that Thomas had been systematically testing different preservation methods on various body parts, meticulously documenting the results over time. The entries, dating back to March 1893, showed an evolution from professional experimentation to something far more disturbing, an obsession with achieving perfect, lifelike preservation, particularly of female features. More concerning were the modifications to the connecting door leading to the private residence. The door had been reinforced with additional locks, not on the business side, but on the residential side, as if to keep something in rather than out. When questioned about these unusual features, Thomas became highly agitated, insisting that the workers focus only on the roof damage and leave everything else untouched. William Hayes, one of the volunteer firefighters present that night, later described Thomas's behavior as that of a man protecting something far more valuable than property. He hovered about us constantly, moving items out of our way before we could examine them, repeatedly checking the locked door to his residence as though afraid it might somehow open of its own accord. Hayes also noted that despite the late hour and emergency conditions, Thomas was fully dressed in a formal suit, as if prepared for company. His clothing seemed at odds with the situation, Hayes recalled. He wore a formal black suit with a cravat, looking more ready for a funeral service than emergency repairs in the middle of the night. Stranger still was a smudge of what appeared to be rouge or similar cosmetic on his shirt cuff, something one would hardly expect to find on an undertaker who works with the deceased. It was during this commotion that Constable Porter, who had accompanied the emergency workers, heard what he described as a woman's voice, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere in the residence. When he attempted to investigate, Thomas physically blocked his path, claiming that his wife was ill and disturbed by the noise and confusion. Porter's account of this moment is precise. I distinctly heard a female voice beyond the connecting door. It was not speaking words, but rather making a low, melodic sound, almost singing, but without lyrics. When I mentioned this to Blackwood and suggested that perhaps Mrs. Blackwood required assistance given the state of the building, he became pale and insisted that she was resting comfortably and must not be disturbed. His reaction seemed disproportionate to my inquiry. Porter also noted that Thomas positioned himself specifically to block view of a particular area near the connecting door, where water had begun to seep under from the damaged roof. His concern appeared focused not on the structural damage itself, Porter wrote, but on preventing anyone from approaching that section of wall where water stains were spreading across the floorboards toward the residential portion of the building. The constable might have accepted this explanation had it not been for what happened next. As described in Porter's subsequent report, dated November 16th, a crash from within the residence drew everyone's attention. Thomas rushed toward the sound, momentarily leaving the connecting door unguarded. Porter, following his instincts as a law enforcement officer, took the opportunity to glance into the residence. What he saw in that brief moment has been debated by Millfield historians for decades. The official report states only that Porter observed conditions within the home that warranted immediate concern for the welfare of Mrs. Blackwood. He immediately called for Thomas to open the residence for inspection, citing public safety concerns related to the structural damage. In his personal journal, Porter was more explicit. Through the partially open door, I glimpsed what appeared to be the sitting room. The space was arranged not as a normal living area, but as a display of some kind. The furniture had been positioned against the walls, and in the center stood what looked like a glass case, similar to those used in museums, but larger, perhaps the size of a small bed. Something was inside it, something the size and shape of a person, though I could not make out details from my position. The crash had come from a fallen bookcase nearby, apparently toppled by water leaking through the ceiling. Blackwood's reaction to my seeing this room was immediate and violent. Thomas's response was unexpected and violent. According to multiple witness statements, he became enraged, shouting that no one was to enter his private quarters under any circumstances. When Porter insisted, Thomas allegedly grabbed an embalming tool from his workbench and threatened the constable. This action led to his immediate arrest for threatening a law enforcement officer, a serious charge even in 1893. Dr. James Harrington, the town physician who was present to treat any injuries from the roof collapse, described the scene in a letter to a medical colleague. "I have never witnessed such a transformation in a man. Thomas, always composed and dignified, became like a cornered animal. His eyes were wild, his voice raised to a pitch I had never heard from him. He brandished a trocar, a sharp embalming instrument, and shouted that he would protect her from their interference at any cost. It required 3 men to disarm and restrain him, during which he continued to rave about keeping her safe and maintaining the perfection." Another witness, Fire Chief Anderson, later testified that during the struggle, Thomas had cried out, "You don't understand what you're destroying. She's perfect now, perfect and unchanging. Years of work ruined by your ignorance." These words, seemingly nonsensical in the moment, would soon take on a horrifying clarity. With Thomas restrained, Porter and 2 other men entered the residence. The constable's report of what they found was vague but troubling. Evidence of unusual and potentially criminal activities related to the practice of anatomical preservation beyond the scope of normal undertaking duties. More specific details were omitted from the public record, with a note that a separate confidential report had been filed with the district attorney. That confidential report remained sealed in county archives until 1968, when it was accessed by Dr. Martin Reynolds, a medical historian researching 19th century mortuary practices. His findings, published in the Journal of Historical Medicine, finally revealed the disturbing truth about the Blackwood home. Dr. Reynolds's article, titled "The Undertaker's Wife, a Case Study in 19th Century Preservation and Psychological Aberration," provided the first comprehensive account of what Constable Porter and his men discovered that November night. Reynolds had not only accessed the sealed reports, but had also tracked down personal journals, correspondence, and medical examiners' notes related to the case, allowing him to reconstruct the events with unprecedented detail. According to the sealed report, the private residence had been converted into something resembling a museum or display room. The furniture had been pushed against the walls to make space for glass cases containing what Porter initially thought were medical specimens or anatomical models. It was only upon closer inspection that he realized they were preserved human remains, parts and pieces carefully preserved and arranged in displays. Porter's confidential statement quoted in Reynolds' article describes the scene. The sitting room contained 5 glass cases of varying sizes. The smaller ones held what appeared to be individual body parts, hands primarily, positioned as if in different gestures, some holding objects such as books or flowers. Each was preserved with remarkable skill, maintaining a lifelike appearance rather than the typical pallor of death. One larger case contained what I initially took to be a mannequin, but soon recognized as a preserved torso, dressed in fine blue fabric cut away to reveal portions of preserved skin underneath, as if demonstrating the preservation technique. The dining room had been similarly transformed, with the table removed to make space for a larger display case containing what Porter described as a complete female form from the waist up, positioned as if emerging from water, the preservation so skillful that one might momentarily mistake it for a wax model rather than human remains. Labels on these cases indicated they were studies or preliminary work, suggesting they were not the final focus of Thomas's efforts. Most disturbing of all was what they found in the bedroom. There, in a specially constructed case of glass and mahogany, was a woman's body, preserved through advanced embalming techniques. She was dressed in fine clothes, her hair carefully arranged, positioned as if merely sleeping on a chaise lounge. According to the report, a small brass plate on the case identified her as Eleanor Blackwood, beloved wife. Reynolds quotes Porter's description. The bedroom had been transformed into a shrine of sorts. The glass case dominated the center of the room, illuminated by carefully positioned oil lamps that cast a soft glow upon the figure within. The woman, presumably Eleanor Blackwood, was arranged in a reclining position, wearing an evening gown of deep burgundy velvet. Her skin had an unnatural sheen, and her features were set in a serene expression. Her hands were positioned delicately across her waist, a wedding ring visible on her finger. The preservation was masterly, creating an unsettling illusion of life temporarily suspended rather than permanently extinguished. Most disturbing was the attention to detail. Her lips had been tinted a natural pink, her cheeks rouged, and her eyes, which were open, had been treated to maintain their luster, giving the horrible impression that she might at any moment blink or turn her gaze toward us. The room contained other disturbing elements suggesting Thomas's relationship with the preserved body went beyond professional practice or even respectful remembrance. A small table near the case held a journal in which Thomas had recorded daily, one-sided conversations with Eleanor. Books lay open as if in the middle of being read aloud. A phonograph with a mechanism for automatic rewinding stood nearby, explaining the singing or humming sounds neighbors had reported. Thomas had apparently played music for his wife, even in his absence. The implications were immediately apparent to Constable Porter. There was no living Eleanor Blackwood. The woman who had supposedly married Thomas earlier that year was already deceased when she arrived in Millfield, or perhaps had never existed at all. The subsequent investigation revealed a complex and disturbing situation. Medical examination of the preserved body, conducted by Dr. Frederick Werner from Boston, estimated that the woman had been dead for approximately 8 to 10 months before November 1893. This timeline suggested she had died before the reported marriage ever took place. Dr. Werner's report, included in the county medical examiner's files, provides a clinical assessment of Thomas's work. The subject displays evidence of sophisticated preservation techniques, including arterial embalming with a solution containing higher than standard concentrations of formaldehyde, arsenic, and mercury compounds. Additional subcutaneous injections of preservative appear to have been administered regularly, explaining the unusual quantities of chemicals purchased by the subject. Most remarkably, the tissues show evidence of experimental treatments to maintain elasticity and color, including methods I have not previously encountered in American mortuary practice. The technical skill involved is considerable, suggesting specialized knowledge beyond standard undertaking training. Werner's report also noted signs that Thomas had continually refreshed the preservation, making ongoing adjustments and improvements, rather than completing the process once. The body shows evidence of multiple interventions over time, he wrote, with newer preservation compounds layered over older ones, suggesting a continuous process of maintenance rather than a single treatment. The fingernails and hair appear to have been regularly manicured and cosmetics recently applied. Most disturbing is evidence of mechanical articulation points in the major joints, allowing the position of the body to be adjusted, much like a sculptor's armature. When confronted with this evidence while in custody, Thomas Blackwood finally revealed his story, documented in a confession dated November 20th, 1893. According to his statement, he had indeed met Eleanor Pierce in Harrisburg the previous year while attending a conference on modern embalming techniques. They had formed a connection, and Thomas had proposed marriage before returning to Millfield. Eleanor had agreed to join him in the spring, but in January of 1893, Thomas received word that she had succumbed to pneumonia. Devastated by the loss of what he called his only chance at happiness, Thomas traveled to Harrisburg for her funeral. It was there, by his own admission, that a terrible idea took hold. Thomas's confession, excerpted in Reynolds's article, reveals the progression of his disturbed thinking. As I gazed upon her face, still beautiful in death, I was struck by the inadequacy of conventional preservation methods. Having studied the most advanced techniques in Europe, I knew that I possessed the knowledge to maintain her appearance far beyond what ordinary embalmers could achieve. The thought of Eleanor committed to the earth, to corruption and decay, became unbearable. I conceived of a different fate for her, one that would allow her beauty to remain, allow us to be together despite death's intervention. With his expertise in embalming and body preservation, Thomas arranged to have Eleanor's body released to his care, claiming to be her fiancée, with the right to determine her final arrangements. He transported her remains back to Millfield, but instead of laying her to rest, he embarked on what he called his great work of devotion, preserving Eleanor in a lifelike state using experimental techniques he had been studying. I worked tirelessly, his confession continues, refining methods I had only theorized about previously. The initial preservation was merely the foundation. Week after week, I applied new treatments to maintain the suppleness of her skin, the clarity of her eyes, the perfect form of her features. I discovered that different tissues respond uniquely to preservation methods. Hands required special attention to maintain their graceful appearance. Facial features needed particular care to prevent the slackness that betrays death. Each success led to new experiments, new techniques that I documented meticulously for future reference. The marriage announcement, the accounts of a shy bride, the purchases of unusual chemicals, all were part of an elaborate deception to explain Eleanor's presence in his home while hiding the terrible truth. Thomas had been living with his preserved fiancée for months, speaking to her, reading to her, even taking his meals beside her glass case. I created a semblance of life around her, Thomas wrote. Each evening I would sit beside her case and read aloud from the books she had once mentioned enjoying. I played the piano for her, the same melodies I remembered her humming during our brief time together. I changed her clothing with the seasons, adorned her with jewelry suitable for different occasions. In my mind, we were truly married, truly living together despite the barrier of glass between us. When I spoke of her to others in town, I was not conscious of deception. In my mind, Eleanor was as real and present as any living wife. Most disturbing was Thomas's conviction that his preservation techniques were gradually approaching a state of perfection that might somehow bridge the gap between death and life. With each refinement, each new formula I developed, she seemed more present, more herself, he wrote. Sometimes, in certain lights, I would catch what seemed to be the slightest movement, a flutter of eyelashes, the gentlest rise of her chest, as if drawing breath. I began to believe that with sufficient skill and devotion, the boundary between death and life might not be as absolute as we are taught to believe. The confidential report noted that Thomas showed no remorse for his actions, insisting that he had acted out of love and devotion. He viewed his preservation of Eleanor not as a crime, but as an achievement, a way of denying death its victory. In his mind, she was not truly gone as long as he could still see her, still be in her presence. Dr. Werner, who examined both Eleanor's remains and Thomas's detailed journals, noted in his report, "The subject appears to have progressed from professional interest in advanced preservation techniques to obsession, and finally to a delusional state in which the preserved remains became, in his mind, a living companion." His journals document this psychological deterioration alongside his technical achievements. Early entries maintain a clinical tone, discussing chemical formulations and tissue responses. Later entries become increasingly personal, describing conversations with the deceased, plans for their future together, and his distress when preservation challenges arose. The final entries suggest complete detachment from reality, with Blackwood describing improvements in his wife's condition and her responses to his attentions. Werner concluded his report with a professional assessment that was also a damning indictment. From a technical perspective, Blackwood's preservation methods represent significant advances in the field, achieving results I would have deemed impossible with current techniques. From a human perspective, however, they represent a profound perversion of both science and love, a refusal to accept death's reality that led to a systematic violation of natural and social boundaries. The legal system of 1893 was ill-equipped to handle such a case. There were clear violations of laws regarding the treatment of human remains, but the unusual nature of the offense left authorities uncertain about how to proceed. Thomas was initially held on charges of grave desecration and improper transportation of a corpse across state lines. The district attorney's notes, preserved in the county archives, reveal the difficulties presented by the case. While Blackwood's actions are undoubtedly disturbing and contrary to public decency, they present novel legal questions. He obtained the body legally, with documentation showing he was recognized as the deceased's fiancé. The desecration statutes typically address acts of damage or disrespect to remains, whereas Blackwood's actions, however misguided, were intended to preserve rather than desecrate. His mental state clearly indicates diminished capacity, raising questions about criminal responsibility versus medical intervention. The notes continue. Perhaps most troubling is determining the appropriate charge for his elaborate deception of the community, presenting a deceased woman as his living wife. While morally reprehensible, it is unclear what specific statute addresses such behavior. Fraud seems inadequate, given the deeply personal rather than financial nature of the deception. We are essentially being asked to criminalize a form of madness, for which our legal framework has no precise category. While awaiting trial, Thomas's mental state deteriorated rapidly. Prison records from December 1893 describe him as alternating between periods of complete silence and frantic monologues addressed to his absent wife. He repeatedly requested permission to return to his home to tend to Eleanor, showing no comprehension of the gravity of his actions. The prison physician, Dr. Samuel Brooks, documented Thomas's decline. Patient exhibits signs of acute melancholia, alternating with agitation. He expresses constant concern not for his legal situation, but for the condition of the preserved remains, insisting that without his specialized care, she will begin to change. When informed that the remains have been removed for proper burial, he became severely distressed, claiming that she will think I've abandoned her. His physical health is declining in parallel with his mental state. He refuses most food, sleeps poorly, and has developed a persistent tremor in both hands. By mid-December, Thomas had become almost entirely unresponsive, speaking only to ask about Eleanor or to request materials to continue his work. He began to create detailed drawings on any available surface, the walls of his cell, scraps of paper, showing anatomical studies and chemical formulas related to preservation techniques. The prison chaplain who visited him reported that Thomas seemed to exist in a different reality, one in which his actions were not only justifiable but noble, the actions of a man who had found a way to transcend death's limitations through devotion and scientific prowess. On December 18, 1893, before his case could go to trial, Thomas Blackwood was found dead in his cell. The official cause of death was recorded as heart failure, though some historical accounts suggest it may have been suicide. A small note was reportedly found in his hand, containing only the words, "returning to her." Dr. Brooks's final entry regarding Thomas reads, "Found deceased at approximately 6:15 a.m. Position of the body and facial expression suggest he died without struggle or distress." A small vial was discovered beneath his mattress, likely containing a preparation of prussic acid, though how he obtained this remains unknown. If self-administered, as seems likely, the method indicates his professional knowledge was turned finally upon himself. A scrap of paper clutched in his right hand contained a message suggesting he viewed his death as a reunion rather than an ending. The autopsy report confirmed cyanide poisoning as the cause of death. The prison warden's investigation was unable to determine how Thomas had obtained the poison, though suspicion fell on a fellow inmate who worked in the prison infirmary and might have had access to medical supplies. No charges were ever filed, as many in authority privately considered Thomas's death a fitting conclusion to a case that had disturbed the community so deeply. The aftermath of the Blackwood case left Millfield in a state of shock. The funeral home was closed permanently, and the building remained vacant for years, with locals avoiding it out of superstition and disgust. The town council eventually voted to have the structure demolished in 1901, and the land was converted into a small park that exists to this day. Town council minutes from January 1894 reflect the community's desire to distance itself from the scandal. Motion brought by Councilman Harper to revoke the business license formerly granted to Blackwood Funeral Home and to prohibit future mortuary businesses from operating at that location. Motion carried unanimously. Discussion followed regarding the disposition of the building, with general agreement that its continued presence serves as an unwelcome reminder of recent distressing events. No immediate action taken due to unresolved estate matters. The inventory of the Blackwood home, conducted as part of the estate settlement, provides a glimpse into the extent of Thomas's obsession. The document, preserved in county probate records, lists dozens of specialized instruments, chemical compounds, and reference books on anatomy and preservation. Most disturbing is the entry for personal effects of deceased female, presumably E. Pierce, Blackwood, which includes 23 dresses, multiple pairs of shoes, gloves, and accessories, all arranged by season and stored as if for a living woman's use. The inventory also mentions a collection of photographs found in a locked drawer of Thomas's desk, showing Eleanor while alive in Harrisburg, as well as a series of images documenting his preservation process. These photographs, deemed too disturbing for public record, were ordered destroyed by the court, though descriptions in the inventory suggest they revealed a progression from conventional embalming to increasingly elaborate presentations of the deceased, culminating in the lifelike display discovered in November. As for Eleanor, her preserved remains were finally given a proper burial in Millfield Cemetery, though records of the exact location have been lost over time. A small ceremony was held, attended primarily by town officials rather than mourners, as Eleanor had no known connections in Millfield beyond her disturbed husband. Reverend Thompson, who presided over the burial, wrote in his journal, "Today we committed to earth the mortal remains of Eleanor Pierce, a woman denied proper rest by misguided devotion." The ceremony was brief, attended only by Constable Porter, Mayor Williams, and 2 council members. No headstone will mark the grave by decision of the council to prevent the site from becoming an object of morbid curiosity. I offered prayers not only for her soul, but for that of Thomas Blackwood, whose mind became so twisted by grief that he could not recognize the sanctity of death's boundary. May God have mercy on them both. Inquiries to Harrisburg eventually confirmed that an Eleanor Pierce had indeed died there in January 1893, though her relationship with Thomas remained somewhat ambiguous. Church records indicated she had attended several social events with him during his visit in November 1892, and her landlady recalled that she had spoken of a promising connection with a gentleman from Massachusetts. Her death certificate listed pneumonia as the cause, and initial burial records showed interment in Harrisburg Cemetery, before Thomas arranged for her disinterment and transfer to his care. The case might have faded completely from memory had it not been for a series of articles published in the Millfield Gazette in 1925, written by reporter Howard Jenkins, the son of Sarah Jenkins, whose diary first noted the strange activities at the Blackwood home. Howard's 3-part series, The Undertaker's Bride: Millfield's Darkest Secret, revived interest in the story and ensured its place in local lore. Jenkins's articles, while sensationalized in places, were based on extensive research, including interviews with aging residents who remembered the events and access to documents that had previously been restricted. The series caused a minor controversy in Millfield, with some older residents objecting to the revival of what they considered a closed chapter in the town's history. Others, however, found the story fascinating, particularly the younger generation who had grown up hearing only whispered references to the Undertaker's wife. The final article in Jenkins's series ended with a paragraph that would prove prescient. Though the physical traces of Thomas Blackwood's disturbing obsession have been removed from our town, the story itself has become part of Millfield's hidden history, a cautionary tale about the dangers when professional skill becomes twisted by personal desperation. The park that now stands on the site of his home is pleasant and ordinary by day, but some say that on quiet nights, particularly in autumn, there remains a strange quality to the air there, a lingering unease that defies rational explanation. In 1962, during renovations to the park that had once been the site of the Blackwood Funeral Home, workers discovered a small metal box buried beneath what would have been the foundation of the building. Inside was a collection of photographs showing various stages of Thomas's work on Eleanor's remains, along with detailed notes on his preservation techniques. These materials were immediately seized by local authorities and eventually transferred to the State Medical Examiner's Office for historical documentation. The discovery renewed interest in the case among medical historians and forensic scientists. The preservation methods documented in Thomas's notes were remarkably advanced for their time, incorporating techniques that would not become standard practice until decades later. Some of his experimental approaches to tissue preservation were of particular interest to researchers in the field of medical specimen conservation. Dr. Lawrence Mitchell, a forensic pathologist who examined the materials in 1964, wrote in his assessment, "Blackwood's methods, while developed for disturbing purposes, demonstrate remarkable ingenuity and technical skill. His formulations for maintaining tissue elasticity and preventing discoloration were decades ahead of their time. Had his research been conducted within ethical boundaries and shared with the medical community, they might have significantly advanced the field of anatomical preservation. This case presents the troubling paradox of valuable scientific innovation arising from deeply problematic psychological motivations." Mitchell noted that some of Thomas's chemical preparations, particularly those designed to maintain the flexibility of preserved tissue, contained compounds and proportions similar to those developed independently for museum specimens in the 1940s. It appears that Blackwood, driven by his personal obsession, stumbled upon preservation solutions that would not be formally discovered by legitimate researchers for another half-century, he wrote. His work represents a dark, parallel track of scientific discovery, advancing along similar chemical principles but guided by disturbing personal rather than professional motivations. Perhaps the most unsettling postscript to the story came in 1968 when Dr. Etor Reynolds, the medical historian who had uncovered the sealed report, visited Millfield to complete his research. During his stay, he interviewed several elderly residents who still remembered the scandal, including Margaret Wilson, the 86-year-old daughter of grocer Samuel Wilson. Margaret, who had been a child when the events took place, recalled something her father had told her years later. According to Samuel Wilson's account, Thomas had once mentioned that Eleanor had a rare condition that required her to remain in complete darkness for extended periods. When Wilson had expressed concern, Thomas assured him that he was providing his wife with the best possible care. "My father always believed something was wrong," Margaret told Dr. Reynolds in a recorded interview, now housed at the Millfield Historical Society. "He said there was something in Thomas's eyes when he spoke of her, something that wasn't love exactly, but possession, as if she were one of his specimens, even before she died." This insight raises disturbing questions about Thomas's relationship with the real Eleanor. Was she truly his fiancée who had tragically died? Or had he identified her as a subject for his obsession while she was still alive? The limited records from Harrisburg offer no clear answers, and the full truth died with Thomas Blackwood in that jail cell in December of 1893. During his visit to Millfield, Reynolds also spoke with Elizabeth Gardner, whose grandmother had lived near the Blackwood Funeral Home in 1893. According to family stories passed down to Elizabeth, her grandmother had once glimpsed what she believed to be Mrs. Blackwood at an upstairs window of the residence. Grandmother said the woman didn't move like a normal person, Elizabeth recalled. She stood very still at the window for nearly 10 minutes, then seemed to turn away with a stiff, mechanical motion. Grandmother thought perhaps she was ill or heavily medicated. Now, of course, we understand what she likely saw. Reynolds's research also uncovered a detail that had been overlooked in previous accounts of the case. Among Thomas's possessions, catalogued after his death, was a collection of literature related to the growing spiritualist movement of the late 19th century. Books and pamphlets on seances, spirit photography, and communication with the dead. Marginalia in these texts suggests Thomas had initially sought supernatural means of connecting with Eleanor after her death, before turning to his preservation techniques as a more scientific approach. It appears that Blackwood's descent into obsession followed a trajectory from conventional grief to spiritualist exploration to his ultimate perversion of undertaking skills, Reynolds wrote in his article. What began as the universal human desire to maintain connection with the deceased evolved through increasingly extreme attempts to deny death's reality, culminating in the physical preservation that he mistook for triumph over mortality. What remains is the story of a man whose professional familiarity with death twisted into something far more disturbing, an inability to accept its finality, a desperate attempt to preserve not just a body, but the illusion of companionship. In his distorted mind, Thomas likely saw his actions as a triumph over mortality, a testament to his skill and devotion. For the residents of Millfield, however, the case of the Undertaker's wife became a cautionary tale about the dangers of isolation and unchecked obsession. The town's subsequent morticians were subjected to much greater scrutiny, with regular inspections of their premises becoming standard practice well into the 20th century. Town records show that when a new funeral home opened in Millfield in 1897, the business license came with unusual stipulations: quarterly inspections by both the health department and the constable's office, restrictions on residing on the business premises, and limitations on the types of chemicals that could be stored on site. These measures, clearly a response to the Blackwood case, remained in effect until a comprehensive state law governing mortuary practices was passed in 1921. Today, few visitors to the pleasant green space on Evergreen Street realize they are standing on the site of one of New England's most macabre historical cases. A small plaque commemorates the park's establishment in 1901, but makes no mention of the Blackwood Funeral Home or the disturbing events that led to its demolition. The park itself is unremarkable: a few benches, mature maple trees, and a small fountain added in the 1950s. Nothing in its peaceful appearance suggests its disturbing history. Yet local residents have long reported unusual phenomena associated with the location. Some claim that flowers planted there wilt prematurely despite adequate care. Others mention a persistent coldness in certain areas of the park, even on warm days. In 1978, a local historical preservation group proposed installing a small informational marker about the Blackwood case, arguing for its significance in the town's history and in the development of modern mortuary regulations. The proposal was soundly rejected by the town council, with one member stating, "Some aspects of our past are best left unmarked, particularly when they involve such a profound disturbance of natural and moral order. Yet for those who know where to look, hints of the story remain. In the town archives, in academic journals of medical history, and in the collective memory of a community that still occasionally whispers about the Undertaker who couldn't bear to part with his bride." The Millfield Historical Society maintains a small collection of artifacts related to the case, though they are not prominently displayed. These include Thomas's business ledger, a few of his professional tools, and copies of the newspaper articles announcing his marriage and, later, detailing his death. Notably absent are any photographs or personal effects of Eleanor, A deliberate decision by the Society's board to respect the dignity of someone who, in death, was denied the peace and privacy that should be every person's right, according to their acquisition policy. As we conclude this account, one final detail bears mentioning. When Dr. Reynolds completed his research in 1968, he reported a curious experience on his last night in Millfield. Staying at a bed and breakfast just down the street from the former Blackwood property, he was awakened around 3 a.m. by what he described as the faint sounds of a woman humming a melody. The sound seemed to be coming from the direction of the park. When he mentioned this to his hostess the next morning, her face reportedly paled. "You heard her too," was all she said, before changing the subject. In a footnote to his published article, Reynolds wrote, "While I maintain the professional skepticism appropriate to historical research, I must acknowledge that my experience that night in Millfield left a lasting impression. The melody was distinct, yet difficult to identify, something in a minor key, with a lilting quality that seemed at once mournful and strangely content. Having spent weeks immersed in the details of the Blackwood case, I cannot rule out the possibility that suggestion influenced my perception. Nevertheless, the incident provides an interesting footnote to an already unusual historical case. Is this merely an embellishment to an already disturbing historical account? Perhaps. But visitors to Millfield Park on cold autumn evenings sometimes report a strange sensation, a feeling of being watched by eyes that don't quite understand they should no longer be seeing, and occasionally, very occasionally, the sound of a woman humming softly in the darkness. The caretaker who has maintained the park since 1992, Robert Hamilton, has his own perspective. "I've worked here for over 30 years, he told a local reporter in 2017, and there are places in this park where the grass grows differently, more lush, almost unnaturally green. They correspond roughly to where the old building's foundations would have been. I'm not a superstitious man, but I've never felt entirely alone when working here after sunset. There's a quality to the silence that feels somehow occupied." For in the case of Thomas and Eleanor Blackwood, the line between preservation and perversion, between devotion and desecration, was crossed in ways that leave an impression not just on history, but perhaps on the very fabric of the place where it occurred. Some violations, it seems, echo long after the perpetrators and victims have returned to dust. The story serves as a reminder of how thin the veil can be between love and obsession, between professional dedication and personal madness. Thomas Blackwood began as a respected craftsman, applying his skills to ease the grief of others by preserving dignity in death. How tragic that those same skills, turned inward by loss and isolation, led him to deny the very natural processes his profession was meant to honor. In the end, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case is not what Thomas did to Eleanor's remains, but what his actions reveal about the human capacity to rationalize the unthinkable when driven by loss and loneliness. His technical achievements in preservation were remarkable, but they came at the cost of his humanity and Eleanor's dignity. The silence of Millfield Park may indeed be haunted, not by supernatural presence, but by the echoes of a fundamental boundary crossed, a natural order disturbed by a man who could not accept that some losses must simply be endured.